Imagine this. It's a freezing night on a lonely mountain road. A tired Marine veteran is driving home with his German Shepherd when the dog suddenly growls at the darkness. He hits the brakes. There's a crushed car in the ditch. Two parents. Gone. And in the back seat, barely breathing, a little girl who has no one left in the world. Most people would call 911 and keep driving, but this Marine doesn't walk away. What starts as a rescue turns into a one-in-a-million bond, a new family born out of the worst night of their lives, and maybe, just maybe, a quiet miracle from God on the side of the highway. If you want to see how a simple choice can change 3 lives forever, stay with me to the end of this story. And if you like these emotional, faith-filled stories, please hit subscribe, leave a comment, and thank you so much for watching. Winter had settled hard over western Montana, turning the mountains into dark, sleeping giants. The 2-lane highway cutting through the pines was little more than a narrow strip of asphalt swallowed by darkness, its edges buried under frozen gray snowbanks. A thin mist crept up from the river below, spreading across the road like low, ghostly smoke, and the sky above was a heavy, starless black, the kind of night where the world felt smaller and lonelier than usual. The air outside was well below freezing, so cold that every breath became a cloud, and the only sound for miles was the muted hum of an old engine pushing forward through the quiet. A battered, dark blue pickup crawled along with cautious patience, its headlights cutting short tunnels of light into the fog. Behind the wheel sat Jack Miller, a 38-year-old former Marine whose broad shoulders made the worn driver's seat seem too small. His face was rough and angular, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of gray-streaked stubble, and his short, dark hair was trimmed in the no-nonsense style he had never shaken off from his service days. A faint, pale scar traced along the right side of his neck and disappeared under the collar of his flannel shirt. Another ran across the knuckles of his left hand. Old souvenirs from places far hotter and noisier than these frozen mountains. His eyes were a tired, clear blue, the kind that had seen too much and learned to stay watchful, even on an empty road at night. He wore a heavy olive-green field jacket, the fabric faded at the seams, and his hands gripped the steering wheel with the relaxed control of someone who had spent years driving through danger, always ready for something to go wrong. In the passenger seat sat Rex, his constant companion. Rex was a 4-year-old German Shepherd with a powerful, well-muscled build and a thick black and tan coat that looked almost glossy in the glow from the dashboard. His ears were pricked and alert, his posture straight even while sitting, and his amber eyes scanned the darkness ahead with an intelligent intensity that mirrored Jack's own caution. There was a faint notch missing from one ear, a small imperfection that only made him look more battle-tested, and when he breathed, it was steady, controlled, like he too understood this lonely drive through the cold demanded respect. Rex had been trained, first by handlers who cared about commands and discipline, and later by Jack himself, who cared about loyalty and trust. The dog was confident, but not reckless, protective but not aggressive without reason, the kind of animal who read the room and the road before deciding what to do. Jack kept the truck at a safe speed, tires humming softly. He knew this road well. It led from the small town where he bought supplies back to his modest cabin tucked into the trees. He liked the isolation, the distance from crowds and questions. Out here, there were no explosions, no radio calls, no sudden orders, just the wind, the snow, and the sound of Rex shifting in the seat beside him. Still, old habits never truly died. His eyes moved between the road, the rearview mirror, and the tree line, He watched for deer, for ice patches, for anything out of place. That was why, when Rex suddenly stiffened, Jack noticed it immediately. The dog's ears went rigid, his body leaning slightly forward. A low growl started deep in Rex's chest, not loud but insistent, the kind of sound Jack had learned never to ignore. "What is it, buddy?" Jack muttered, his voice low and steady. Rex didn't look at him. Instead, the dog stared through the windshield, nose twitching, amber eyes focused on the darkness ahead as if he could see something Jack couldn't yet. A half-second later, Jack caught it too, a strange flicker of light. Not the steady glow of a car driving toward them, but an erratic glint off to the right, barely visible through the fog and the trees. Jack narrowed his eyes and eased off the gas. The light wavered again, like a reflection moving where no reflection should be. Then he saw it more clearly. The faint, unnatural angle of something metallic down the snowy embankment, just beyond the reach of the normal line of sight from the road. His stomach tightened. "Damn," he breathed. He guided the truck to the shoulder, wheels crunching on packed snow, and brought it to a stop. Rex was already turning toward the passenger door, restless, sensing urgency. Jack flipped on his hazard lights, grabbed the heavy flashlight from the console, and shrugged deeper into his jacket. The moment he opened the door, a blast of freezing air knifed into the cab, and his breath turned to steam in front of his face. "Stay with me, Rex," he ordered, though he knew the dog would never do anything else. They moved quickly toward the edge of the road. From this angle, Jack could see it clearly. A dark SUV had left the highway, plowed through the snowbank, and smashed nose first into a thick pine tree about 15 feet down the slope. The front end was crushed, twisted metal and shattered glass glittering faintly under the beam of his flashlight. One headlight was still on, flickering weakly. The other hung broken, pointing uselessly at the ground. The whole scene looked wrong and silent, as if time had stopped at the moment of impact. Jack's training kicked in before fear had a chance to fully form. His pulse quickened, but his hands stayed steady. He scanned for skid marks, for smoke, for fire. There was no flame, no smell of gasoline, just the sharp bite of cold air and the faint metallic scent of overheated engine parts cooling too fast. "Rex, heel!" he commanded, and the dog moved right at his side as they descended the slippery slope. Jack's boots dug into the packed snow, every step deliberate. Falling here would cost precious seconds. He reached the driver's side first. The window was shattered, frost already gathering on the jagged glass. Inside, a man in his late 30s or early 40s lay slumped against the deployed airbag, his head turned at an angle that made Jack's stomach twist. The man's dark hair was matted with blood near the temple, his skin deathly pale under the weak light, his chest disturbingly still. Jack reached through broken glass, fingers pressing against the man's neck, searching. Nothing. No pulse. No flutter. Just the awful, heavy quiet of a body that would not move again. Jack swallowed hard and shifted the beam of his flashlight toward the passenger seat. A woman, about the same age, with shoulder-length light brown hair and a soft, gentle face that now looked terrifyingly still, was pinned by the seatbelt, her head thrown back against the headrest. Her eyes were half open but unfocused, staring past the cracked windshield into nothing. He checked her too, hoping for something, anything. There was none. The cold seemed to press closer as he realized both adults were gone. Somewhere deep in his chest, an old bitterness stirred. He had seen this kind of sudden ending before, In other places, under different skies, it never felt right. Rex let out a sharper bark, drawing Jack's attention to the back seat. The dog's nose pushed at the broken edge of the rear window, ears twitching. Then a low whine escaped him, urgent, almost pleading. Jack lifted the flashlight and shone it into the rear of the SUV. At first he saw only crumpled blankets, a spilled backpack, shattered plastic. Then something moved, small, trembling. A tiny sound, a weak whimper cut through the cold like a thread. "Hang on," Jack murmured, more to that sound than to himself. The rear door on the driver's side was crushed and jammed. He tried the handle anyway, it didn't budge. He moved quickly to the other side, boots slipping slightly, Rex right beside him, whining softly now. The opposite rear door was bent but not completely destroyed. Jack yanked on the handle. It gave a little, but not enough. He braced one foot against the side of the SUV and pulled with all the strength in his shoulders and back. Metal groaned, something snapped, and the door tore open just enough for him to wedge his body through. Inside, curled awkwardly in the corner of the back seat, still strapped in but half twisted out of position, was a little girl. She looked about 8 years old, small and fragile, in a puffy purple winter coat that was smeared with blood from a cut on her forehead. Her hair was a light chestnut brown, tangled and messy, falling into her face, and her skin was ashen under the streaks of tears and dirt. Her lips were bluish from the cold, and her eyes, large hazel eyes, fluttered weakly, struggling to stay open. She was whimpering in little bursts, not fully aware of where she was, but aware enough to be terrified. Hey, I've got you," Jack said softly, his voice dropping into the calm, steady tone he used to use with wounded soldiers. "My name is Jack. I'm here to help you, okay?" His words came out in slow, clear pieces, careful and reassuring. The girl tried to focus on him, and for a second he saw a flash of confusion and pain in her gaze. Her breath rattled shallowly. He quickly checked her for obvious injuries. The seatbelt had dug into her shoulder and chest. There was the cut on her forehead, and she was shaking uncontrollably from the cold and shock. But he saw no bones protruding, no unnatural angles in her limbs. "We need to get you out of here," he murmured. With practiced hands, he clicked open the seatbelt, supporting her small body so she wouldn't fall. She let out a small cry when he moved her, but he kept talking, low and steady, as though his voice could build a bridge between fear and safety. He maneuvered her carefully out through the gap in the door, shielding her as best he could from the broken glass. The moment they reached the winter air, the cold attacked her exposed skin, and she gasped. Rex stepped closer, sniffing gently at her dangling hand, his tail low but softly wagging, the dog's posture a perfect mix of alert and gentle. "This is Rex," Jack said, kneeling in the snow with the girl in his arms. "He's a good boy. He's going to help keep you warm." The girl's fingers twitched, curling slightly into Rex's fur as if drawn there by instinct. Jack carried her up the slippery slope with careful, deliberate steps. At the top, near the truck, he laid her on a folded blanket he kept behind the seat and wrapped another around her small body. Rex immediately lay down close against her side, pressing his thick, warm coat against her, effectively becoming a living heating pad. The girl let out a tiny sigh, some of the trembling easing as she buried her face in his fur. Jack shrugged off his own jacket and draped it over her as well, ignoring the bite of the wind against his now thin layers. With his free hand, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice, when he spoke, was clipped and precise, the way it used to be over a radio. Single vehicle accident on Highway 2, about 15 miles west of town, near mile marker. He rattled off the details, his eyes never leaving the girl's face as he monitored her breathing. 2 adults in the front, no signs of life. 1 child, female, approximately 8 years old, semi-conscious, cold, possible head injury, in need of immediate medical attention. The dispatcher's voice was calm and efficient, promising an ambulance as fast as the weather allowed. When he ended the call, the night felt even quieter, as if waiting. The girl's eyes fluttered open again, just enough for him to see the confusion in them. "Mom?" she whispered, voice raw and thin, the single word sliced through him. Jack paused, the truth heavy on his tongue, knowing this was not the moment to let it land. "You're safe right now," he said gently instead. "You're going to the hospital soon, okay? You just hang on. I'm here. Rex is here." He squeezed her small hand lightly, a firm, grounding pressure. She didn't seem to fully understand, but she clung to that contact, to Rex's warmth, as if it was the only solid thing in a spinning world. Minutes stretched out, marked only by the girl's shallow breaths, the sound of Rex's slow panting, and the distant hiss of the wind through the trees. Jack glanced back once at the ruined SUV below, a dark shape against the snow, and felt the weight of what he had seen settled heavily in his chest. He had spent years trying to leave death behind, but tonight it had found him again on a frozen mountain road. Only this time, there was one life he could still hold on to. At last, faint at first, and then growing clearer, came the sound of a siren cutting through the night, a thin wail bouncing off the canyon walls. Red and blue lights began to flicker against the fog, approaching fast, painting the trees in brief, haunted colors. The girl stirred at the sound, her fingers tightening weakly in Rex's fur. Jack stayed beside her as the ambulance pulled up, as paramedics hurried over with blankets and equipment, as they carefully transferred her onto a stretcher and began their urgent, practiced work. He stepped back just enough to let them do their job, but stayed within her line of sight. As they lifted her toward the ambulance, her hazel eyes found his one more time. For a moment, in that brief, fragile look, he saw a silent question, a plea not to disappear like everything else had. Jack nodded once, a small promise he wasn't sure he understood yet, but he felt it settle into him just the same. The doors of the ambulance closed with a hollow thud, the lights spinning brighter as the engine revved. Jack stood at the side of the road with Rex, watching as the siren's cry faded into the distance and the vehicle disappeared into the dark highway. The cold wrapped around him again, but something else wrapped around his thoughts, a quiet, unsettling certainty that the road he had chosen, the quiet life he was trying to build in his cabin among the pines, had just been changed in ways he could not yet see. He looked once more at the mangled SUV down the embankment, at the shattered remnants of a family's journey cut short on a frozen night, and the feeling crystallized inside him like ice. His life had just taken a turn it would never undo. The world came back to her in pieces, the sharp sting of antiseptic in the air, the faint beeping of monitors somewhere above her head, the whisper of soft-soled shoes moving up and down a hallway. Harsh, fluorescent light pressed against her closed eyelids until she forced them open, blinking at a ceiling she did not recognize. For a long second, she didn't move at all, afraid that if she did, the dark, twisted trees and screaming metal from the night before would come crashing back. When she finally turned her head, something warm and familiar grounded her before the fear could swallow her whole. Rex lay on the floor beside the hospital bed, a big black and tan shape on a thin blanket a nurse must have dragged in for him. His thick coat looked slightly ruffled, his ears half raised, his amber eyes following every sound with that calm, steady intelligence that made him seem almost human. As soon as he saw her looking down at him, his tail thumped once against the floor, slow and reassuring. He lifted his head and nudged his nose toward the edge of the mattress, offering his presence like a promise. "You're still here. You're not alone." Just beyond Rex sat Jack, folded awkwardly into a plastic chair that was far too small for his broad frame. His olive green jacket was unzipped now, revealing a faded gray t-shirt stretched across his chest, and his head was tipped forward as he dozed in the harsh light. The stubble on his jaw had grown thicker, shading his face and making the scars near his neck stand out more clearly. Even in sleep, there was a tension in his posture, as if some part of him expected to be shouted awake by an alarm at any second. One hand rested near Rex's back, close enough to touch, and that tiny distance said more than any words about the bond already forming between man and dog. The girl swallowed, her throat dry and sore. "Mom?" she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop it. The sound was small and cracked, but it was enough to make Jack jerk awake. He blinked hard, orienting himself, then leaned forward, his blue eyes softening when he saw her. "Hey," he said quietly, voice low and rough from lack of sleep. "You're awake. That's good." He reached for the plastic cup on the bedside table, its straw sticking out at an awkward angle, and held it toward her. "Small sips, okay?" She took a little water, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the cup. "Where?" Her gaze drifted around the room. The pale green walls, the curtain pulled halfway across the glass window in the door, the monitor with its soft, blinking lights. "Where am I?" "You're at the hospital in town," Jack said gently. "They brought you here after the accident." The word accident made something shift in the back of her mind, like a door cracking open to let in a gust of cold wind. She remembered headlights, her mother's voice singing along with the radio, the sudden scream of tires. Her face crumpled. My mom. My dad. Jack's jaw tightened for the briefest moment, and his eyes flicked down, the weight of what he knew pulling at him. Before he could answer, there was a knock at the door, and it swung inward. A woman stepped inside, carrying a clipboard pressed against her chest. She was in her early 40s, maybe, tall and lean, with a posture that spoke of long days on her feet. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back into a low bun that had started to loosen around her temples, sending a few strands across her forehead. She wore simple black pants, a cream blouse, and a soft gray cardigan that made her look more like a patient's kind aunt than a government worker. Her face was open and expressive, with warm brown eyes and faint lines at the corners that hinted at a life spent listening more than talking. Her skin was fair, dusted with the lightest freckles across the bridge of her nose, and there was a gentleness in the way she moved, as if she'd learned long ago that sudden motions could frighten already frightened people. "Good morning," she said softly, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. "I'm Sarah Johnson. I work with Child Protective Services for the county." She gave the girl a small, reassuring smile before glancing at Jack. "You must be Mr. Miller." "Jack is fine," he replied, standing automatically, the old habit of coming to his feet when someone new entered still ingrained in him. He looked down at Sarah with that steady, assessing gaze of his, taking her in the way he used to read the faces of new officers, looking for arrogance, for indifference, for anything that might be dangerous. What he saw instead was tired compassion and a kind of stubbornness that said she'd spent much of her life pushing against systems bigger than herself. Sarah stepped closer to the bed, her eyes softening as she looked at the girl. "And you must be Emily," she said gently. "The paramedics found some things in the car. Your backpack, your school ID." She paused as if giving the name time to land. "Is it okay if I call you Emily?" The girl, Emily, nodded slowly, her eyes brimming. "Where are my mom and dad?" she asked, the question finally spilling out in full. For a long second, no one spoke. The monitor beeped softly, and somewhere out in the hallway a cart rattled past. Sarah drew in a quiet breath and sat down on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle Emily's bandaged leg. "Emily," she said, her voice low and steady. "The doctors and paramedics did everything they could. But the crash was very bad. Your mom and dad were hurt too badly for them to fix. They didn't make it." The words seemed to hang in the air like frost. Emily stared at her, as if the sentence were in another language. Then, all at once, the meaning hit. Her small face twisted, and a sound came out of her chest that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She shook her head, hands curling into fists on the blanket. "No," she choked. "No, we were just driving." Sarah didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply stayed there, one hand resting lightly on the rail of the bed, the other reaching slowly toward Emily's elbow. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "I know it doesn't feel real yet. It might not for a long time." Emily's gaze darted around wildly, as if trying to find a way out of what she'd just heard, and landed on Jack. You were there," she said, her voice shaking. "You pulled me out. You saw them. Tell her she's wrong." Jack's throat worked. He stepped closer, feeling suddenly far too large for the room. "I was there," he said quietly. "I got you out of the car. I checked on them." His eyes met hers, and he let her see the sadness there. "Sarah's telling you the truth, kiddo. I'm sorry." The fight went out of Emily all at once. She collapsed back against the pillow, tears spilling down the sides of her face into her hair. Rex, unable to stand it, rose and placed his front paws carefully on the edge of the bed, stretching his head close enough that she could reach him. Emily's hand found his fur, fingers tangling in the thick ruff around his neck. She buried her face there, sobbing into his warmth as his tail wagged slowly, his steady presence absorbing some of the shock. Hours slid by in a fog of nurses checking vitals, a gray-haired doctor with kind eyes listening to Emily's breathing and murmuring that physically she was lucky, that things could have been much worse. Jack stayed through all of it. He signed a few forms as Good Samaritan witness, answered the same questions about the accident more than once, and every time someone suggested he go home to rest, he shook his head. "I'm fine," he would say, though the dark circles under his eyes deepened. She shouldn't wake up alone. Sarah watched all of this with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many children wake up in too many strange rooms. Later, in a small family consultation room with beige walls and a coffee machine that made everything taste burnt, she spread a few folders across the table and tried to explain the situation to Jack. "Emily doesn't have any close family in the state," she said, tapping a page that showed a basic family tree. "Her grandparents are gone. There's an aunt in another state, but they're not in contact. The system will try to find a placement, but..." She sighed, and for a moment the professional mask slipped, revealing the frustration underneath. "Right now our foster homes are overflowing. Sometimes kids move 3 or 4 times in a year. Different schools, different houses, different rules. It's a lot, especially after something like this. Jack leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. The idea of Emily being shuffled from one stranger's couch to another made his jaw clench. He thought of barracks, of temporary bases, of men who never knew if the place they slept would still be there next month. He knew what it was to live out of a bag, never sure where you belonged. She barely lets anyone near her, Sarah continued. The nurses told me she wouldn't eat until you came back into the room this morning. And that dog. She glanced through the small window in the door, where Rex's ears were just visible at the edge of the frame as he guarded Emily's bed. A faint smile tugged at her lips. He's like her anchor right now. He's good at that, Jack said quietly. Sarah folded her hands atop the folder, studying him. I have to ask, she said, her tone careful but direct. Are you planning to stay involved in her life? You don't owe anyone that. You did more than most people would just by stopping that night. Jack looked down at his scarred hands, remembering the heavy silence in the crushed SUV, the way Emily's small fingers had clung to his sleeve. He also remembered other nights, other bodies he hadn't been able to help, and the way those memories still woke him up in the dark. I was the last one there with her parents, he said slowly. I was the one who pulled her out when they couldn't. Feels wrong to just walk away. Sarah nodded, as if she'd expected that answer but needed to hear it aloud. There is an option, she said. It's not simple, and it's not something I suggest lightly. But given how she's responding to you and Rex... She slid a form across the table. The court can appoint a temporary guardian while we sort out longer-term arrangements. It would mean she stays with you for now. Weeks, maybe months. While we see what's in her best interests long-term. You'd have responsibilities, but also a say in her care. Jack stared at the form. Lines of legal language blurred together, but a few words stood out. Temporary custody, guardian, care and protection. For a man who had spent years running toward danger in uniform, the idea of signing up to be responsible for a grieving child in his quiet, fragile life felt in some ways even more terrifying. I live in a cabin outside town, he said. It's small. I don't know anything about raising kids. I barely know what I'm doing half the time myself. Sarah's eyes softened. I've seen a lot of different homes, Jack. Big houses that looked perfect from the outside but felt cold inside. Tiny apartments that were cramped but full of love. Emily doesn't need perfect. She needs safe. She needs someone who won't disappear the second things get hard. She paused. From what I've seen in the last 12 hours, you're already doing that. The memory of Emily's tear-streaked face buried in Rex's fur rose up in his mind. He could still feel the weight of her hand, small and desperate, clutching at his sleeve. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost like surrender. What happens if I say yes? He asked. We file an emergency petition with the judge, Sarah replied. There will be a hearing, but for now the hospital can discharge her into your care instead of sending her to a temporary shelter. I'll be checking in, of course. You won't be alone in this. There was something firm in her voice when she said that, a promise from someone who had walked many families through fire and knew the way out, even if the road was rough. Jack picked up the pen lying on the table. It felt heavier than it should. He looked through the small window again and saw Rex's silhouette shift as a smaller shape. Emily reached out to pat his head. That tiny, simple movement was somehow louder than the sirens had been the night before. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. Later, back in the room, Sarah explained things to Emily in words a child could understand, talking about staying with Jack and Rex for a while, and having a place that's just yours while we figure things out. Emily listened with red-rimmed eyes, her hand never leaving Rex's fur. When Sarah asked if she would feel okay going with them, the girl glanced up at Jack. He didn't make any big speeches. He just nodded once, gently. "It won't be fancy," he said, "but it'll be safe, and Rex already likes you." Emily hesitated, then gave the tiniest nod in return. By the time she fell asleep again, curled on her side with Rex's head resting on the mattress near her hand, the papers were filed, the decision made. Somewhere in the quiet hum of the hospital's heating system and the soft ticking of the wall clock, a new, unexpected shape of family began to form. One none of them had seen coming. But that was now, whether they were ready or not, very real. The road out of town grew narrower the farther they drove, trading stores and gas stations for long stretches of pine forest and open fields dusted with old snow. Emily sat in the passenger seat this time, strapped in carefully, swallowed up in a navy hoodie that hung past her wrists. She watched the scenery slide by without really seeing it, her small hands twisting the edge of the fabric. Every so often the truck hit a bump and she flinched, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as if expecting headlights to come out of nowhere again. Behind them, Rex lay stretched across the back seat, head resting between the front seats so he could keep both of them in sight. His eyes moved from the road to Emily's pale face and back again, as if he understood that the silence in the cab wasn't the peaceful kind Jack usually liked. When they finally turned onto the gravel driveway that led to the cabin, Emily lifted her head a little. Jack's place sat in a small clearing, a weathered log cabin with a metal roof and a narrow front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The wood was faded to a soft gray, and one of the porch steps had a crack in it that Jack always meant to fix and never did. A single chimney rose from one side, sending a thin thread of smoke into the cold air, and beyond the cabin, a stand of tall pines guarded the property like silent sentries. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was solid, quiet, and the air smelled of sap and wood smoke instead of antiseptic and rubber gloves. Jack killed the engine and glanced at Emily. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic, "but it's home." Inside, the cabin felt even smaller with a child in it. The living room held a sagging couch, a scarred coffee table, and a black iron wood stove with a neat stack of chopped logs beside it. The kitchen along the far wall was cramped but tidy, with mismatched mugs and plates stacked on open shelves and a refrigerator humming softly in the corner. Down the short hallway were two doors. Jack had spent the last day moving his own duffel bag and old gear into the smaller room, so Emily could have the one with the better window. Now that room contained a twin bed pushed against the wall, a patched-together wooden dresser, and a small bookshelf he'd bought second-hand years ago and never really used. He had found an old quilt his mother had mailed him long ago, faded reds and blues, hand-stitching still visible, and spread it over the bed, hoping it made the room feel less bare. Emily stood in the doorway, staring at the space that was supposed to be hers. It didn't look anything like her old room, with its posters and stuffed animals and fairy lights, but there was a window that looked out over the trees, and sunlight slid in across the floorboards in a way that made the dust motes look like tiny floating stars. Rex trotted past her, jumped lightly onto the bed as if to test it, then looked back at her and wagged his tail once, inviting her to join him. She took a few hesitant steps inside, one hand trailing along the edge of the dresser, then sat on the bed's edge. The mattress squeaked softly under her weight. For a moment, she almost looked like any tired kid moving into a new house. Then her eyes clouded, and she turned her face toward the window, shoulders curling inward as if she were trying to shrink out of sight. That first evening was a clumsy dance. Jack, who was used to heating up canned soup or throwing together simple meals for one, stood in the kitchen staring at the contents of his fridge like they were a puzzle he'd never learned how to solve. He settled on scrambled eggs, toast, and a few apple slices arranged on a plate with more care than he wanted to admit. When he set it in front of Emily at the small kitchen table, she picked at the food, managing only a few bites before pushing it away. "I'm not really hungry," she murmured. Jack wanted to insist, to say something about needing strength to heal, but he saw the way her eyes had gone distant again, so he just nodded and wrapped the leftovers for later. That night, Emily insisted on leaving the bedroom door cracked open and the hall light on. Jack didn't argue. He stretched out on the couch with a blanket thrown over his legs and Rex lying on the rug beside him, both of them listening to every creak of the cabin. Sometime after midnight, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and Jack heard it. A choked little cry from down the hall, followed by a muffled, "Mom! Dad!" It made his chest constrict. He sat up, instinct pulling him to his feet, but then the sound faded into soft sobs and finally into silence. He hovered there, torn between giving her space and rushing in. In the end, he stayed in the hall for a few minutes, watching the thin strip of light under her door, ready if she called out again. She didn't. He went back to the couch, but sleep, when it came, was thin and restless. The days that followed settled into a fragile routine. In the mornings, Jack fumbled his way through making oatmeal and toast, pouring orange juice into a glass that had once held beer, while Emily sat at the table in an oversized sweater, spoon stirring the same spot in her bowl long after the food had gone cold. He drove her to the small elementary school in town, in the same truck that had carried her away from the accident days earlier. The first time they pulled into the drop-off loop, Emily's hands tightened on the seatbelt, and her breathing quickened. Jack put the truck in park and turned to her. "I'll be right here at the end of the day," he said. "And if it's too much, you tell your teacher. They'll call me." Her teacher was a woman named Ms. Carter, in her mid-30s, with curly dark hair pulled away from her face by a colorful headband and warm brown skin that seemed to glow under the fluorescent classroom lights. She wore a simple cardigan over a shirt with tiny printed stars and jeans that had a smear of whiteboard marker near one pocket, the mark of someone who never stopped moving. Her eyes were bright but lined with the kind of tiredness that comes from caring deeply for a lot of children at once. She walked out to meet them with a practiced, gentle smile. "You must be Emily," she said, crouching to bring herself closer to the girl's height. "I'm really glad you're here today. We're going to take things slow, okay?" She gave Jack a quick, assessing look and offered her hand. "You must be Mr. Miller. We'll keep an eye on her." Her tone was steady, professional but kind, the voice of someone used to being the bridge between home and school for kids carrying heavy things. Inside the classroom, Emily felt eyes on her. Kids with backpacks slung over their shoulders paused mid-conversation to glance her way. A boy with freckles across his nose leaned over to whisper something to his friend, and both of them stole quick looks at her bandaged forehead. At recess, a girl with a pink headband walked up and asked, "Are you the one who was in the car crash? My mom said," but stopped when she saw Emily's face crumple. Emily turned away without answering, moving toward the fence that edged the playground, fingers gripping the cold metal links as if they were bars. She spent the rest of recess staring out at the parking lot, heart pounding, wishing she could follow the line of trees back to the cabin instead of returning to math problems and curious stares. Rex became her reward at the end of each hard day. Jack, knowing how much the dog meant to her, started bringing Rex along in the truck at pickup time. When the final bell rang and kids poured out of the building, talking and laughing, Emily stepped through the doors and immediately spotted the familiar black and tan shape leaning out the rear window of the truck. Ears perked. Her shoulders eased a fraction. She walked faster. Rex's tail thumped wildly when she opened the door, and he pushed his head into her chest, snuffling into her hoodie as if confirming she was all in one piece. On evenings when the weather wasn't too brutal, Jack took them both for slow walks along the quiet rural road, Emily in the middle, holding Rex's leash while Jack walked on the far side. The rhythm of their footsteps on gravel, the sound of Rex's collar jingling, and the way the setting sun painted the snow pink made those walks feel like the gentlest kind of medicine. Still, the nights remained the hardest. Emily often woke with a jolt, heart racing, the echo of twisting metal and her mother's scream ringing in her ears. Sometimes she stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling until the shadows calmed. Other times she choked back sobs into her pillow so no one would hear. Jack, too, found old ghosts rising. A slammed cupboard door or the backfire of a truck on the highway could yank him back to desert roads and explosions, to nights when he'd checked for pulses and found none. More than once he woke on the couch with his heart hammering, sweat cooling on his skin, until he heard the soft creak of the cabin and Rex's steady breathing and remembered where he really was. One particularly cold night, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing sharp wind that rattled the windows and made the branches scrape against the roof. Jack was half asleep on the couch when a piercing scream tore down the hallway. He was on his feet before he knew he'd moved, Rex already sprinting ahead of him. They burst into Emily's room to find her thrashing in the bed, hands clawing at the blankets, eyes squeezed shut. "Mom! Dad! Don't go!" she sobbed, voice cracking. Jack crossed the room in 2 strides and sat on the edge of the bed, careful but quick. "Emily, hey, it's Jack," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're safe. You're in the cabin. It's just a dream." Rex jumped up beside them, pressing his solid weight against her legs, his warm breath huffing softly as he pushed his head under her trembling hand. After a moment, her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, then slowly recognized the shapes around her. Jack's lined, worried face, Rex's fur under her fingers, the familiar quilt. Her sobs softened into hiccups. I'm scared," she whispered hoarsely. Tears still streaked her cheeks, shining in the dim light from the hallway. "I keep seeing it, over and over. The car, the tree, their faces." She swallowed hard, then looked up at him, something new flickering in her gaze. "But thank you for saving me." The words hit him harder than any blast. For a second, Jack couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and he had to look away, staring at the worn grain of the wooden floor until he could trust his voice. "You don't have to thank me," he managed finally. "But you're welcome." He shifted slightly, leaning back against the headboard so she could rest against his shoulder if she wanted to. She did, hesitantly at first, then with more weight, her small body curling toward him as Rex settled across their feet, like a furry guardian. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm pacing outside while the cabin held its ground. In the quiet between Emily's slowing breaths, Jack felt something settle into place. Not as loud as an oath spoken on a battlefield, but just as binding. They were no longer simply a rescuer, a rescued child, and a dog. They were, whether any of them had meant to be or not, beginning to feel like a family. It was a gray Saturday afternoon when Sarah's dusty county sedan crunched up the gravel drive to the cabin, bringing the past with it in a cardboard box. The sky hung low and heavy over the trees, clouds the color of dirty wool pressing down on the tops of the pines. Emily watched from the front window, one hand resting on Rex's neck, as the car door opened and Sarah stepped out, cardigan pulled tight against the chill. There was something different in the way Sarah moved this time. A carefulness, as if she were carrying something fragile, even before she lifted the box from the back seat. Jack met her on the porch, hands shoved into the pockets of his flannel shirt. Up close, he could see that Sarah looked more tired than the last time he'd seen her. The faint smudges under her eyes were deeper, and a strand of dark blonde hair had come loose from her bun, blowing across her freckled cheek. She gave him a small, apologetic smile. "I went by the impound lot yesterday," she said quietly. "They finally released what they could salvage from the car." She shifted the box in her arms and lowered her voice even more. "Some of it is paperwork. Some of it is personal." On the coffee table a few minutes later, they laid it all out. At the top, carefully placed as if whoever had packed the box had known it mattered most, was a pink backpack with a small embroidered unicorn on the front pocket. The fabric was scuffed and stained, the zipper pull bent, but it was undeniably Emily's. Next to it were a handful of printed photos, sunny images of 3 smiling faces at a park, on a beach, in front of a Christmas tree, and a small metal tin with a dent in one side. Beneath those lay a thick envelope of documents held together with a rubber band. Emily hovered at the edge of the room, bare toes curling against the rug. Her eyes locked onto the backpack as if it were a living thing. Color rose and fell in her cheeks, grief and longing and fear battling just under the surface. "You don't have to look yet," Jack said gently. "We can put it away until you're ready." Emily shook her head once, sharp and decisive, though her hands trembled when she reached for the backpack. She sat on the couch, Rex lying at her feet like a furry shadow, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes fixed on her. Sarah took the armchair, deliberately leaving space, her posture open but not intrusive. Jack lowered himself onto the far end of the couch, close enough to help if needed, far enough not to crowd. Slowly, Emily unzipped the backpack. On top, folded carefully, was a purple hoodie she recognized immediately. The sight of it made her suck in a sharp breath. Underneath was a worn paperback chapter book, a small hairbrush with loose strands of light brown hair caught in the bristles, and a pack of colored pencils with 3 shades missing. Tucked into the back compartment, protected by a plastic sleeve, she found a single envelope with her name, written on it in her mother's looping handwriting. "For Emily, only if you need it." Her fingers froze around it. For a moment she seemed unable to move, the room shrinking around that one piece of paper. Jack leaned forward slightly. "Do you want me to read it with you?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Will you read it out loud?" Her voice was very small. "My hands are shaking." Jack took the envelope as if it were made of glass. He opened it carefully, smoothing the letter between his big, scarred hands. The paper was creased but intact, the ink slightly smudged where someone's fingers had lingered while writing. He cleared his throat and began. The letter wasn't long. It talked about how much her parents loved her, how proud they were of her kindness and her stubborn little streak. It mentioned the trip they had been on, the hope of a fresh start in a town by a lake, a small house where they would finally have a yard and a tree sturdy enough for a swing. But woven between those everyday details was something heavier, an acknowledgement that life was unpredictable. that sometimes bad things happened even when people were careful. "If you are reading this," her mother had written, "it means something happened, and we couldn't be there to hold your hand through it. But we believe, with every piece of our hearts, that the world still has good people in it. We believe you will find them, or they will find you. Let them love you like family, even if they don't share your last name." By the time Jack reached the last lines, his voice had grown huskier. Emily's shoulders were shaking, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't look away. When he finished, there was a long, thick silence. Emily's gaze drifted from the letter to Rex, then to Jack, then to Sarah. Something in her eyes had changed. Not the pain, that was still there, but a tiny, flickering recognition. The good people her mother had written about were not theoretical anymore. They were sitting in the room with her. Sarah cleared her throat softly and reached for the envelope of documents. "There's more," she said. "Some of this will be boring grown-up stuff, but it matters for your future, Emily." She spread the papers out. An insurance policy with dense lines of text, a bank letter about a small life insurance plan, copies of IDs, and a folded brochure with a photo of a modest gray-blue house beside a lake. "This was in the glove compartment," she explained. "It looks like your parents had already put a deposit on a place in a town called Clearwater Bay. They were driving there when—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tucked into the stack was a small USB drive labeled "For Later" in black marker. Sarah turned it over between her fingers. "We had the hospital IT guy check it for viruses," she said. "It's safe. Looks like home videos. If you ever want to watch them, Jack's computer should do it." Jack glanced at the insurance policy, scanning the jargon with a soldier's focus. "So, what does all this mean?" he asked. "For her?" "It means there are resources," Sarah replied. "Not a fortune, but enough that, handled properly, it can help with her needs. School, counseling, maybe one day, a home in that town, if that's still the right path." She looked at Emily, her brown eyes steady. "Your parents tried very hard to make sure you wouldn't be left with nothing, Emily. They were thinking about you, even about things they didn't want to imagine." The idea of Clearwater Bay hung in the air between them, like a picture on a hook. Emily picked up the brochure with both hands, studying the photo. A small house with white trim, a porch swing, and a glimpse of water glittering behind it. "They told me about a lake," she whispered. "They said there would be ducks, and that maybe we could get a dog if the landlord allowed it." She reached down and buried her fingers in Rex's fur. "Guess I got the dog part." Later that week, after Sarah spent hours on the phone guiding them through the first steps with the insurance company and the bank, Jack made a decision. "We should go there," he told her quietly as they stood on the porch, watching Emily and Rex in the yard. Emily was kicking at pockets of old snow while Rex trotted beside her, nose down, tail up. Clearwater Bay, not to stay, just to see it, to finish what they started. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It could be good for her," she said. "Closure, maybe. But it won't be easy. You'll need to stop by the accident site on the way if you're going that far. And the insurance office there will want signatures, IDs, proof of guardianship." She gave him a wry half-smile. "Bureaucracy doesn't stop for grief." 2 mornings later, under a pale sky, the three of them, Jack, Emily, and Rex, set out in the pickup. In the back seat, a small bouquet of grocery store flowers lay on top of Emily's backpack, the pink unicorn patch mended as best Jack could manage with his clumsy hands. The USB drive and letter stayed at home, tucked safely into a drawer. Some things were not ready to travel yet. They stopped first at the curve of the highway where it had all begun. Snow had melted and refrozen since that night, leaving the ditch crusted and hard. The tree that had taken the impact still bore the raw, pale scar where bark had been stripped away. Jack parked on the shoulder, hazards blinking, and they got out in silence. Emily walked slowly to the edge of the embankment, Rex at her side. She stood there for a long time, staring down at the place where metal had twisted and lives had broken. When she finally knelt, her knees pressing into the cold ground, her voice was barely more than a whisper. She told her parents she missed them, that she was angry they were gone and grateful they had loved her enough to plan ahead. She said she'd met the good people they'd hoped for, a man who made awkward scrambled eggs and a dog who wouldn't leave her side. Jack stood back, hands in his pockets, throat tight, listening without intruding. When she finished, she laid the flowers carefully at the base of the tree. Rex sniffed them once, then sat beside her, leaning his weight against her shoulder. From there, the miles to Clearwater Bay went by in a blur of highway signs and changing scenery. The town itself was small, tucked around the curve of a clear, deep lake, with a main street lined by brick buildings and a bakery that smelled like warm cinnamon when they drove past. At the modest brick insurance office, a middle-aged man with thinning gray hair and a neat tie, Mr. Dawson, the local claims representative, met them in a cramped conference room. He had kind eyes behind his smudged glasses and the careful, measured speech of someone who had spent his life navigating rules while trying not to forget the people behind them. He walked Jack through the paperwork, asked Emily a few gentle questions, and made notes about setting up a fund in her name. "Your parents did right by you," he said softly to her as they left. "They did everything they could." By late afternoon, the winter light was already beginning to thin when they followed directions out of town, past a row of bare maple trees, and turned down a quiet lane that ended near the water. There, just as in the brochure, stood the house. Small, gray-blue siding, white trim, a short porch with a wooden swing hanging slightly crooked from rusted chains. Beyond it, the lake stretched out like a sheet of dull silver, ringed by dark trees. They stood on the gravel for a long time without speaking. Emily held onto Rex's collar, her hair lifted gently by the cold breeze coming off the water. Jack took in the sagging porch boards, the peeling paint on the front steps, and the view of the lake that was somehow both sad and beautiful. He could almost see the ghost of another family walking up those steps with suitcases, laughing, making plans. "This was supposed to be our new home," Emily said quietly. Jack nodded. "Maybe it still can be someday," he replied. "Or maybe it's just a place to remind us that they wanted you to keep living, to have something good." Emily didn't answer right away. But as she stared at the little house by the lake, her shoulders straightened just a fraction, as if a tiny part of the burden she carried had been set down on that gravel, left there with the ghosts of her parents' hopes. Whatever came next, this place would stand in her memory not as the life she'd lost, but as a marker for the new one she was stumbling toward, with a quiet Marine, a stubborn German shepherd, and a future that, while different than anyone had planned, was slowly beginning to take shape. Almost a year had slipped by since the night the fog swallowed the road and twisted metal changed everything, and the mountains around Jack's cabin wore a different face now. Winter had come and gone, painting the trees white and then letting them drip green again. The gravel drive, once marked by the hesitant footsteps of a frightened girl, now held familiar patterns: smaller sneakers, bigger boots, and the paw prints of a German shepherd who believed every inch of it was his territory to guard. The cabin had changed too. There were drawings taped crookedly to the fridge, some of a lake and a little gray-blue house, some of a dog with ears too big and tail too long, and a pair of pink sneakers lived permanently by the door next to Jack's worn work boots. The second bedroom, once spare and quiet, now held books piled in messy stacks, a stuffed animal dog that Rex suspiciously sniffed but accepted, and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling in uneven constellations. Emily had changed most of all. She was a little taller now, her light brown hair grown past her shoulders, usually pulled back in a ponytail that bounced when she ran. The haunted look in her hazel eyes had softened. The shadows that used to live there had retreated to the edges, no longer the whole story. She still had nights when memories came back too sharp, but there were more mornings when she woke up thinking about spelling tests or art projects instead of trees and headlights. She went to school every day, backpack slung over one shoulder, and when she came out in the afternoon, she didn't just look for Rex's ears in the truck window. She looked for Jack, too, and her wave was no longer tentative. She had a couple of friends now, a serious girl named Lily who liked to read, and a freckled boy named Mason who talked too much, but always shared his snacks. They weren't best friend necklace close, but they sat with her at lunch and didn't flinch if she went quiet when certain topics came up. That was enough for now. Jack had changed in smaller, quieter ways. His laugh, once rare and short, showed up more often now, especially when Emily told a story about school in that quick, breathless way she had. He still carried himself with the solid, coiled readiness of a Marine, but the edges had rounded a little. The lines at the corners of his eyes came more often from squinting into the sun on school fields instead of staring into sandstorms. Therapy, something he had resisted his whole life, had found its way into his routine once he started taking Emily to see a counselor. Her therapist, Dr. Annika Patel, was a woman in her early 40s with dark hair streaked neatly with silver, calm brown eyes, and the kind of posture that radiated both strength and gentleness. She wore simple blouses, comfortable shoes, and kept a box of tissues always within arm's reach, but she did not treat either of them like they were fragile glass. For Emily, she drew feelings charts and helped her name the heaviness in her chest. For Jack, she occasionally asked a question that landed like a well-aimed stone in still water, sending ripples through things he'd long tried to bury. Slowly, between those sessions and the daily work of packing lunches, signing school permission slips, and fixing a leaky faucet because we live here now, Jack's world stretched beyond the four walls of his own past. Rex remained, as ever, the steady center of their little universe. Now 5 years old, he was fully in his prime, stronger, broader through the chest, but still moving with the athletic grace of a well-trained working dog. His black and tan coat gleamed when Emily brushed him on the porch in the evenings, and his amber eyes kept their sharp intelligence. He learned new routines easily, knowing exactly when it was time to wait by the truck for school pickup, when to curl up by Emily's bed on the nights she still needed him close, when to nudge Jack's hand away from a third cup of coffee and toward the leash hanging by the door. In the quiet hours after Emily fell asleep, Rex sometimes lay with his head on Jack's knee while Jack read over letters from the insurance fund or pamphlets about volunteer opportunities, as if the dog were auditing every decision. One bright spring morning, as sunlight slanted through the kitchen window, and reflected off a half-finished bowl of cereal. Sarah pulled up the drive again. Emily watched from the table, spoon paused mid-air, as Sarah got out of her car with a slim, leather folder tucked under one arm. She still wore her sensible shoes and cardigan, but today her hair was down for once, dark blonde waves brushing her shoulders, and there was a look on her freckled face that mixed seriousness with something like hope. In the living room, with Rex stretched out at Emily's feet and the hum of the refrigerator filling the pauses, Sarah opened the folder. "It's time," she said softly, looking first at Jack and then at Emily. "The court has scheduled the final hearing. They're going to decide whether Emily stays with you permanently, Jack, or whether they look for another placement." She took a breath and added, "I've submitted my recommendation. I thought you both should hear it from me. I told them this is where she belongs." Emily's shoulders tensed, and her hand tightened unconsciously in Rex's fur. Jack felt something cold crawl under his ribs at the thought of forms and judges and decisions made in rooms where none of the people who mattered, the ones sitting in this cabin, could fully control the outcome. But he just nodded, jaw setting in that stubborn way Sarah now recognized. "Tell us what we need to do," he said. The courthouse in town was a modest brick building with white columns that had seen better paint jobs. Inside, the family courtroom was small, with wooden benches polished by years of anxious parents and social workers. The judge was a man in his early 60s named Harold Thompson, tall and a bit stooped, with a thick head of white hair and deep grooves around his mouth that suggested he'd spent a lifetime frowning in concentration more than smiling for cameras. He wore wire-rimmed glasses low on his nose, and when he looked over them, his pale gray eyes seemed to weigh people carefully, as though measuring not just their words, but the space between them. A silver wedding band on his left hand had a worn, dull shine, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but held just a trace of the Midwest town he'd grown up in, far from here. He had presided over enough hard cases to know that the law was blunt and life was complicated. They all stood as he entered, then sat. Sarah presented her report, speaking clearly about the last year, about Emily's progress in school, the consistency of the home Jack had made, the way he handled her medical and counseling appointments, the careful way he and Rex had become her emotional anchors. Dr. Patel had submitted a written statement as well, describing Emily's attachment to Jack and the importance of stability for her healing. Jack sat straight in his chair, hands folded tightly together, answering questions from the court's attorney about his employment, his military service, his plans if Emily wanted to go to college one day. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, about nights he'd failed men under his command, about how he couldn't change those, but he could show up for this one child every single day. Then it was Emily's turn. She wore a simple yellow dress and the small silver necklace Sarah had helped her choose, a tiny heart that lay just below the bandage-free scar at her hairline. Her legs dangled from the witness chair, not quite reaching the floor, and her hands twisted in her lap. Judge Thompson leaned forward a bit. "Emily," he said, his tone kinder than it had been with the adults, "I know this is scary, but I need to hear from you, in your own words. Where do you want to live?" She glanced at Jack, at Rex lying obediently beside his chair, ears perked as if he understood every word, and then back at the judge. Her voice shook at first, but as she spoke, it steadied. She told him about the cabin, about how at night the wind still sometimes sounded like sirens, but she felt safe because Jack and Rex were there. She talked about scrambled eggs that were sometimes too dry but always made with the best intentions, about morning drives to school with music playing softly, about how they had gone back to the tree on the highway and to the house by the lake to say goodbye properly to her parents. Her eyes filled when she said, "They told me to find good people who would love me like family. I did. I want to stay where I feel safe and loved. I want to be with Jack and Rex." The courtroom was quiet when she finished. The kind of quiet that feels like everyone is holding the same breath. Judge Thompson took off his glasses and polished them slowly, a familiar gesture for him, then put them back on. He looked at Jack, then at Emily, then at Sarah, who held his gaze with the calm confidence of someone who had seen many hearings and knew when the truth had landed. A few minutes later, after legal language and citations that Emily didn't fully understand, the decision was made plain. The court granted Jack full legal guardianship of Emily, recognizing him as her permanent guardian, the closest thing the law could call a father without erasing the ones she had lost. Jack felt the words hit him like a wave, leaving him breathless. Emily didn't wait for permission. She flung herself into his arms, and Rex, sensing the shift, barked once, a sharp, joyful sound that bounced off the old wooden walls. Even Judge Thompson's stern mouth twitched at the corners before he moved on to his next case. A week later, on a warm afternoon that smelled of thawed earth and pine needles, they returned to the bend in the highway one more time. This time there was no snow, no fog, just a soft breeze and the hum of distant traffic. The tree that had once stood like a jagged wound now had new growth around the scar, pale green leaves trembling in the sun. They parked on the shoulder and walked down the embankment together. Rex trotted ahead and then circled back, staying close without being asked. Jack carried a small wooden sign he had made himself in the evenings after Emily went to bed, his big hands surprisingly careful as he sanded the edges and painted the letters. Now he set it firmly into the ground near the tree, pressing the earth around it until it held. The sign read, "In loving memory," and to remind us that even in the worst moments, we can find those who don't walk away. Emily traced the words with one finger, then looked up at him. "Dad?" she said, the word emerging shy and new, but sure enough to echo between them. It was the first time she'd said it out loud. Jack blinked hard, his throat suddenly thick. "Yeah," he replied, his voice rough. "I'm here." He sniffed and swiped at his eye with the back of his hand. "Must be dust from the road," he muttered. Emily smiled, seeing through it but letting him keep the excuse. Rex wagged his tail so hard his whole body moved, then barked twice, as if stamping the moment into the air. On the drive home, they talked, not about endings, but about what they wanted to do next. There had been a flyer at the grocery store about the local volunteer search and rescue team needing more help, especially people comfortable in rough terrain. Jack had taken one, thinking of his training and of a night on a frozen road. Now, with Emily safely belted in beside him and Rex's head between the seats, it felt less like a reminder of something terrible and more like a map. "We could help other people who get stuck out there," Emily said, nodding toward the winding highway ahead. "Like you helped me." "Like we helped you," Jack corrected quietly, glancing at her and at the dog. "All three of us." The idea settled between them like a promise. They weren't just survivors tied together by one bad night anymore. They were a family, traveling an old road with new purpose, ready to be the kind of people who didn't walk away. Sometimes, God's miracles don't look like thunder in the sky or seas parting in front of us. Sometimes, they look like a tired Marine who decides not to drive past, a stubborn German shepherd who refuses to give up, A little girl who finds the courage to keep living when her whole world has gone dark. In the middle of an ordinary road, on an ordinary day, God can quietly send the right people at the right time to stand beside us so we don't have to walk through the pain alone. Maybe in your own life, the miracle was a neighbor who checked on you, a nurse who stayed a little longer by your bed, a friend who called at just the right moment, or even a stranger who simply didn't walk away when you needed help most. Those small acts of love are not small at all. They are the fingerprints of God in our everyday life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us about a time God sent a Jack and Rex into your life. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Your interaction helps these messages of faith and kindness reach more souls who are feeling lonely or forgotten. From my heart to yours, I pray that God blesses you and your family, heals the hidden wounds you carry, and sends you the right people at the exact moment you need them most. May He protect you on every road you travel, and may you also become a quiet miracle in someone else's life. God bless you, and thank you for watching.